There was now immense pressure on Muhammad and his remaining followers to compromise their message of believing in one God only, and to give in to the Quraysh, or to at least accept some of the other gods worshipped by them. It was at this moment that an event is supposed to have taken place that would lead to a fundamental clash of values, an event that still defines Islam's relationship with the rest of the world. Most Muslims deny that this event ever actually happened, but it has been used by Islam's enemies to condemn both Muhammad and the Quran as bogus. There are many different accounts of this story, but the main version goes something like this. One day Muhammad was sitting somewhere in the Kaaba when he received a new revelation, one which suggested that he could strike a compromise deal with the Quraysh that would allow them to continue to worship their old gods. Well, when the Quraysh heard this, they were overjoyed. At last, they thought, Muhammad was coming back to their way of thinking. But now comes the key part of the story, which is that Muhammad is then supposed to have received another revelation that told him his apparent acceptance of the old gods had actually been inspired by Satan. Hence why these verses were later called the Satanic verses. If true, it seems to suggest that Muhammad was able to alter the divine word of God at will, and that in consequence, both Muhammad and the Quran were fake.
Now, of course, Muslims say this incident did not happen and was manufactured by haters of Islam. It then becomes very hard for them to explain, however, how it got into Islamic sources that are relatively early or are, like Zamakhshari, based on earlier Islamic sources that are lost. One wonders how it is that somebody like that, who was a pious Muslim, would have or could have picked up such a thing if it had originated from the enemies of Islam.
There are three different and conflicting versions of this story in the Muslim histories of Muhammad's life compiled after his death. There is no direct reference to it in the Quran, and neither is it mentioned in the earliest and most reliable account of his life by Ibn Ishaq. Neither is there any mention of it in the great hadiths of the 9th century. Muslims do not generally reject traditions because they're critical of Muhammad, but because they cannot be properly verified. In 1989, a storm of violent protest erupted across the Islamic world when a novel written by Salman Rushdie was published in the UK. The book, The Satanic Verses, is a fictional account of this incident, and Muslims claim depicts Muhammad as an impostor with purely political ambitions, and the Quran as the work of the devil. All over the world, Muslim public opinion was outraged.
Well, the event 14th of January 1989 is the day when I can very clearly remember there were over 1,000 people to a minimum. And just to show that we do disapprove this material, we will publicly burn this book. And that's what we did at that day.
The burning of the book was just the start. Violent demonstrations and riots broke out all over the Muslim world. Attempts by the Muslim community to have the book banned were opposed by many in the name of freedom of speech. This issue was then taken over by Ayatollah Khomeini, the then leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who declared a fatwa, or religious order, against Rushdie, calling for his death by any means. The fatwa has never been lifted, and although Rushdie survived unharmed, numerous people connected with the book have been attacked and even killed. A single contentious event in Muhammad's life, and one most Muslim scholars believe never took place, was being used to define Muhammad, who he was and what he stood for, and most importantly, what it meant to be a Muslim in today's world. What this whole issue did was that it highlighted a fundamental difference of views between those in the West who believed that they had a right to say what they wanted to say, and those Muslims who believed that they had a right not to be insulted.
It was a defining moment. It was the first time that the British Muslims came out as a community to assert themselves. But it was also a defining moment internationally. On one hand, they rejected what Rushdie wrote. They were united in condemning the book. But on the other hand, they were also united in condemning the fatwa. They realized what is going on in the West is not acceptable to them. But they also realized at the same time that certain mechanisms in traditional Islam were also not acceptable to them.
This incident led the Muslim community in Britain to feel that they were part of a larger international Islamic community, with Muhammad at its heart. It would also mark the start of a clash between the liberal values so central to Western identity and the more traditional and conservative views in the British Muslim community. And at the heart of this clash was the character of Muhammad himself, and conflicting opinions as to whether he was a force for good or evil in the world. Whatever the truth of this event, in Mecca, Muhammad was locked into a desperate battle of ideas between his new message of the one God and the old tribal values of the Quraysh.